The Mishnah at the beginning of the Masechet said that you could be Kona and Isha with a star. And if we turn to Daf Tez Zayin Amud Aleph, about 5 lines down from the top, on Tez Zayin, that's page 16, I think. Ubishtar Minolan. Do we have it?
Yep.
Great. Omar Ula, Omar Kra. So Ula pulls out a pasuk in Parshas Mishpatim, in Shmos Chaf Aleph. Im acheres yikach lo. If, in the context of Omevriya, he takes a different woman as a wife, he kisha hakosuv lacheres. Now, in the case of Kiddushin, we have what's called a hekesh havaya liyitzia. So that means that whatever method works for Gerushin, ipso facto works for Kiddushin. And the Torah says in Gerushin, because of Sefer Krisa, so we know that a woman is divorced with a shtar, and therefore she's married with a shtar. Okay then? But in the case of Omevriya, we don't know that he could acquire an Omevriya with a shtar. But since the pasuk says, Im acheres yikach lo, so the Torah uses the word acheres to refer to a regular woman who's married, and is comparing the Omevriya to the regular case of Kiddushin. That's called acheres. Ma acheres mikne b'shtar. Just like you can marry a woman with a shtar Kiddushin, as we derive it from Gerushin with the hekesh havaya liyitzia, Omevriya mikne b'shtar. You can acquire ownership over an Omevriya with a shtar. Now, this is a bit complicated because who's writing the shtar? Normally, let's say in a Kinyan Mechira, the Mocher writes the shtar to the Lokeach. I hereby sell you this piece of property. And in the case of Kiddushin, the Baal, the Makadesh, is writing the shtar, but he's not the one who's being makne, he's being kone. The one who's being makne is the Isha. So that this equation between Acheres and Omevriya is off base, because in the case of Omevriya, it's the Adon who is acquiring ownership over the Omevriya, and the father is being makna the Omevriya to the Adon. And if we assume, therefore, that the father is the one who writes the shtar because he's the makna, so that's okay. Meaning, if we want to maintain the equation to a shtar Kiddushin, then we said in the case of shtar Kiddushin, who writes the shtar? It's the Makadesh. Well, he's not the makna, he's the kona. And if the father is the makna in the case of Omevriya, how can we derive that the father is writing the shtar? That's not at all parallel to the husband who writes a shtar Kiddushin. Gemara says, if you're going to say that the Adon, who's the who's the Kone, if he writes the shtar, then it's a perfect parallel to the husband, the Makadesh, who writes a Shtar Kiddushin. Av Kosvo, Michael and Meimar. But if it's the father who's the Makna who's writing the Shtar, then in the case of Kiddushin, the parallel would be the Isha who's being Makna herself to the Baal, and yet the Shtar is written by the Baal, as we derive it from Gerushin. And it's one of the three methods by which the Baal is Makadesh and Isha. And on this point, who writes the Shtar of an Amevriya? We have machlokas between Rav Huna and Rav Chizda. The Itmar Shtar Amevriya Mi Kosvo. Who writes the Shtar? Is it the Adon, who is the Kone, or is it the Av, who's the Makne? Rav Huna Omar Adon Kosvo, which is very beautiful, because of Adon Kosvo, he is the Kone, and he parallels the Makadesh in the case of Kiddushin. Hence, we have an equation between Shtar Amevriya and Shtar Kiddushin. But according to Rav Chizda, he holds Av Kosvo, and the Av is the Makne, who would be parallel in Kiddushin to the Isha. Well, the Isha doesn't write the Shtar Kiddushin. It's the Baal who writes the Shtar Kiddushin, the Kone. And yet you're deriving Shtar of Amevriya from Shtar Kiddushin. Why is the father, who's the Makne, writing the Shtar, according to Rav Chizda? Rav Huna, Rav Chizda, Michael, and Meimer. What do we do with Rav Chizda? And now the Gemara thinks that according to Rav Chizda, we have to come up with a brand new source to derive the conclusion that you could be Kone, an Amevriya, with a Shtar. And that Shtar, according to Rav Chizda, is going to be written by the Adon. According to Rav Chizda, according to Rav Chizda, the Shtar is going to be written by the Makne, which means the father, which is not parallel to Shtar Kiddushin, because she doesn't write a Shtar Kiddushin as a Makne. It's the Kone, the Makadesh. Omer Rav Achabar, Rav Yaakov, Omer Krolo, Teitze Kitseis Ha'avodim. Now, what is the context of this possible Teitze Kitseis Ha'avodim? We're talking about what's called Shein V'Ayin, otherwise known as Rashi Avar. In the case of an Eved Knani, if the Adon is guilty of taking out the Shein, the tooth, or the eye of the Eved, then the Eved goes free. So that's the case of Eved Knani. Just 1 second. Oh. Now we get to Eved Ivri. Now, in the case of Eved Ivri, we have what's called Dine Nezikin. And the Eved Ivri is considered a valid agent, so to speak. He has his own monetary status. And if the Adon, heaven forbid, takes out the eye of the Eved Ivri, then he has to pay the Dmei Eno. He has to pay the value of the eye as a chovel b'chaver, like any chavol. The Eved will now, instead of going free, he will work as an Eved for the balance of his 6 years, and then he goes free at the end of the 6 years. And that's called, in the language of the Mikra, lo teitze kitzeis avodim. Avol niknes hi kikinyan avodim. In other words, to break up the avdus and grant freedom to the Eved, no. That's not going to happen in the case of an Eved Ivri, and the female of an Eved Ivri would be the Amevriya. But the implication is, as far as Yitzia is concerned, there's no Yitzia. Just he has to pay the Dmei Ayin. But there would be a kinyan, like a kinyan of an Evet. Like an Evet Knani is Nikne B'Shtar, which again is a sugya we didn't get to yet. That's much later on in the Masechet. That an Evet Knani has the status of Karka, just like Karka is Nikne B'Shtar, so too Evet Knani is Nikne B'Shtar. And now the Torah is telling you that Omivriya is like an Evet Knani and she's Nikne B'Shtar. And this will now serve as a source for the Kinyan Shtar and an Omivriya, even according to Rav Chizda, because we are no longer comparing the Shtar of an Omivriya to the Shtar of Kiddushin, but rather the Shtar of an Omivriya is a separate entity with its own dinim. And it's written by, according to Rav Chizda, the father, even though he is the Makna. As opposed to Kiddushin, as we said before, according to Rav Huna, where we have the parallel, because it's the Baal who's the Kohen. But now we have a new pasuk that does not hinge, this Yalfusa doesn't depend upon an equation to Shtar Kiddushin. But rather, in the Parsha of Eved Ivri, we see that there is a kinyan of Shtar. Like the kinyan of an Eved Knani, which is derived, Shtar is derived from the equation to Karka. Correct Gemara, the Ema Avol Niknesi Kikinyan Avodim Anai Ninu Bechazaka. An Evet Knani could be acquired through Chazaka. Rashi here points out what Chazaka means with regard to a human being. Sheachufuhu lasos malach achas. He forces the Evet to do one malach on his behalf, and that's called the Kinyan Chazaka. Maybe what the Torah is telling us is that you could be Kona and Eved Ivri the same way you could be Kona and Eved Knani, but not through Shtar, but rather through Chazaka. On Makra, the pasuk says, "Visnachaltem osam libnechem achreihem." Pasuk in Parshas Bahar, in the context of Eved Knani. And Osam is a reference to what's called an achuzas nachla, which is nicknamed like any karka b'chazaka. But now with darshaning, libnechem achreichem. So it says, "V'snachaltem osam libnechem achreichem." Osam b'chazaka, v'lo acher b'chazaka. The Torah is telling me that the kinyan that is operative with regard to an Eved Knani is not valid with regard to an Eved Ivri. And which kinyan are we excluding with regard to an Eved Ivri? Chazaka. Frekti Gemara v'ema osam b'shtar v'lo acher b'shtar. Maybe what the Torah is telling me is that shtar is not operative by Eved Ivri, it's only valid with regard to Eved Knani. How do you know the Torah is excluding Chazaka by an Eved Ivri? Maybe the Torah is excluding Chazaka by, Shtar by an Eved Ivri. So the Gemara says, "Haksiv lo teitze kitzeis avodim," and that is a reference to Chazaka. Umayrois, how do you know that lo teitze kitzeis avodim is a reference to Chazaka? Maybe I'll argue and insist that's a reference to shtar. Mistaber shtar, havilele rebuya. It makes more sense that the Torah is including shtar as a valid method of being koneh an eved ivri, or for that matter, no ivriya. Shekein motzia bebas Yisrael. We have already a precedent for the efficacy of a shtar with regard to ishus bebas Yisrael. Or omnam, even though it doesn't mean to create ishus, but rather to undermine and terminate ishus, but nevertheless, we find shtar is operative with regard to ishus. And if the Torah is being marbe, a kinyan that operates by an eved, that it should be operative for an amivriya, then we're going to assume that it's a reference to shtar. So Gemara again goes back into the batting box. Adarabba, chazaka v'leila rebuye. Why don't we include chazaka in the kinyan of amivri of eved ivri? Shekein kodev b'nichsei ager. What's Rashi's interpretation of nichsei ager? He says a ger died and he left no yarshim. He wasn't married. He had no children. And his nechasim are hefker. Anyone could come and acquire ownership over nichsei ager after the death of the ger because they're hefker. So you see that chazaka operates with regard to nichsei ager. So Gemara says that's no proof. The ishus mia lo ashkechan. We view amivriya, because of the halach of Yud, as miktas ishus, and therefore, with regard to ishus, where do we find chazaka? An ishus chazaka is not a valid method of acquiring an isha, of generating ishus. Iboisema, the Gemara offers a second alternative answer to the question: how do we know that the Torah is coming to be marbe shtar by ishus? Lahachi ahani imacheres. We go back to the original pasuk, and what was that pasuk? Imacheres yikach lo. So we already have a hekesh to acheres, and here Rashi has a long explanation of what the Gemara has in mind. So I think I'm going to suggest that we sort of run through the Rashi. Maybe we'll come back to it. Rashi says, "Lahachi ahani acheres, hikisha kosev lacheres legalos ala limud shel ktseis havadim." So we're now going to integrate two different yalfusos. One is ktseis lotetze ktseis havadim, and we were vacillating back and forth. What is that coming to be marbe, whether it's a shtar or chazaka? And here's where we're going to go back to the other pasuk, im acheres yikachlam, and that's going to shed a light on the drasha of lo teitze kitzeis havod. Ikisha kosev lacheres legalos al limud shel kitzeis havodim shebo lamdenu al kinyan ashtar v'lo al. I'll add the word kinyan achazok. Aval ikar shtar lav mi Kiddushin yoliv. So we don't have a kash on Rav Chizda, who is of the opinion that it is the father who writes the shtar kinyan for Amivri, because then it's not parallel to shtar Kiddushin. No. Ikar shtar lav mi Kiddushin yoliv. The tema. And therefore, you'd come to the conclusion of Huna and his position that Adon Kosvo, because the Adon is the Kona, like the Baal in the case of Ishus. Ella mishtar karkos yolf kishtar eved knan. So therefore, the father is the mocher or the makne, and just like in karka, it's the mocher who writes the shtar to sell karka, and Eved Kanani has the same status as karka, is therefore in Omevriya av kosvo, ki hechi the shtar sodos mocher kosvo. Just like in the mechir of shtaros, it's the mocher who writes the shtar, and this we derive from a pasuk v'ayikach hasefer makne. So too, in the case of Omevriya, who is the makne, who, so to speak, pardon the expression, selling his daughter as an oma? It's the father, and therefore Rav Chisda is justified as saying that the shtar is written by the adon. After all, we just used the pasuk to justify shtar according to Rav Chisda, who holds adon kosvo. What are we going to do with this pasuk of according to Rav Huna, who's of the opinion that it is the adon who writes the shtar, not the ab? Ahumi boile she'ena yotzes b'roshei evarim ke'eved. That in the case of an omevriya, or for that matter, an eved ivri, there's no yitzia b'shein v'ayin, which is called roshei evarim, like there is in the case of Eved Kanan. But the kinyan of avodim is going to be operative. Rav Chisda, why couldn't Rav Chisda, like Rav Huna, use this possible teitzik etzeis avodim to teach you that lo eniyotza b'roshei avodim in kei lichtov krolo teitzik ke avodim my kitseis avodim shma min otarti. The extra word, the superfluous word kitseis, is going to allow me to derive two different dinim from the pasuk lo teitzik kitseis avodim, and it's a diuk. What's the diuk? That midin yitzia levada miata v'lo midin akin. As far as yitzia b'roshei avarim, there's no din of yitzia b'roshei avarim in Eved Ivri or in Om Ivri like there is in Eved Kanani. But as far as the kinyan is concerned, we still have that din of kinyan, and that is the kinyan of shtar. So there are two dinim that we derive from the pasuk lo teitzei kitzeis avodim. One is the ikar kinyan of shtar, and Omavriya number two, that she doesn't go free with shein v'ayin. Now we go back to the Mishnah. V'kones atzma b'shnayim. I'm sorry, b'shonim. I said shnayim. I meant shonim. So the Eved or the Omevriya goes free after 6 years. Tichsiv, as it says in the Pasuk Mishpatim, Sheish Shonim Yavod u'b'shvius Teitzei Lachavshi. In the 7th year, she goes free. It has nothing to do with Shemitah. Ubi Yovel. And she goes free Yovel if it comes before the 7th year. That the Avdus continues until the year of Yovel. Ubiron Giron Kesef. Let's say she's sold at 600, whatever the number. That means each year is 100 for the 6 years. So let's say after 3 years, she can pay up 300 and redeem herself and go free. And that's called Giron Kesef. Omar Chizkiya, the Omar Krov Hefda, Milame Shemegarea Pijona Viotes. They calculate how many years left she has to the Amhus, and she can pay that price and go free. Tana, we learned in the Brayso V'konis Atzu V'Kesef Ubishav V'Kesef Ubishtar. I understand that she can redeem herself and terminate the Amos with Kesef. Bishlem Kesef T'chsiv Mi Kesef B'Gnosa and Shava Kesef Nami Yoshiv Gulasa. We have a general ribui which applies universally throughout the halacha, throughout Nezikin, and that is Shava Kesef Kekesef. Elahai Shtar Hechi Domi. And it's in the case of Ishus, we have a Kinyan Guf. There, we understand that Shtar, meaning a get, breaks up the Kinyan Aguf. But here, in the case of Amos, which is fundamentally a Kinyan Mammon, of Avdus of 6 years, why should a shtar break up that monetary relationship? If he wrote a shtar for the extra 300, let's say after 3 years, he wrote a shtar chov, that he will pay up 300 is Hainu Kesef. Basically, he's redeeming her with Kesef, or she's redeeming herself. So why do you repeat another form of kesef? Obviously, shtar is a separate category unto itself. Elo shichur shtar. Maybe it means the shtar that the Adon gives her as a shtar shichur. Ishtar Lamalin. Labele biape trey zeal. Inami biape bedina zeal. Why doesn't he just free her, the Adon, and make a declaration zeal in front of Tuedim or in front of Bezdin? Leslie Alayach Midi. That should be enough. Why does it have to be written in a shtar? Omar Rav is also Meres Eved Ivri Gufo Konu. The Adon cannot just say, you know what, you're a free agent. It's as if I got 6 full years of work, of labor from you. You can't just make that declaration, because he has a kinyan in the goof of the Eved Ivri for 6 years. V'arav shemochal girono ein girono mochel. Even though the balance of what the Eved owes to the Adon, which is called girono, is valued at 300, he can't just be mochel the 300 because he has a kinyan aguf on the Eved. And again, Rashi offers a long-winded explanation. Gufo kanui, Sok Rashi, Achi agiu yemei chifusho, until the end of the 6 years or Yovel, and she or he is ready for chofesh to go free. It's gufo kanui lefiachach harav shemochal girono eino mochel tzarich shichur. He's got to give a get shichur or shtarshim. Very difficult. Rashi says im yirtza, as if to say that, in other words, we can't force him to work the Eved. If he was mochel, that means he doesn't, he so to speak, waives his rights to malacha and to avdus. But if he decides he wants to be mavid the Eved or the Amma, then he can do so to lo shayach bo mechilas mammon elo loshen shichu. You can't be mochel something that you own. Like if I own this stender, I can't say, well, I'll mochel it to you. I have to be makneh to you with a kinyan. Because of loy shtar shichur v'nosan le nothing. That's when the Oma goes out free. And when it says v'nosan le, it's a reference to the father. The logara miknani from an Eved Knani did nofek b'shtar d'chsiva chuvsha lo tite lo v'gomar lo b'ish. We have an equation between Eved Knani and Isha. Yisera olav omevriya, omeresh lakish. Omevriya kones atzma b'misa sa'av, mershus adon mikal v'chom. If her father dies, then she goes free. Now, I understand that the Adon, if he dies, she can go free. But now the Gemara is saying that if she goes free with the death of the Adon, how much more so with the death of the father? Why? Who has a greater control or dominion or ownership over the Nara? Is it the father or the Adon in the case of Omivriya? It's the father. And I'll prove it to you because even after she has Simonim, just 1 second. Right, with Simonim, she ends her state of Amhus. Well, what does the Gemara mean? Eina motzia mishus av. Just 1 second. Do you have, by any chance, Ira, a commentary here?
Let me see.
See if you can find the words Masi monim she'ein motzia mishus av.
What does it mean? She develops like signs, right? So she can't she's not being removed from her father's. Do they even say anything like that?
No footnote on that by any chance?
Yeah, the footnote is that the father is still entitled to his daughter's profits of her labor, even after she becomes a Nara.
Oh,
and
okay.
I'm
sorry.
When she reaches,
Ira, I made a big boo-boo.
What?
I thought that she becomes a Bogeris. My mistake. That's 6 months down the line. Sorry.
Yeah, so then he doesn't have the once he becomes.
So she goes from Katniss
Right.
to Narus, and she goes
Right.
out of her state of Avus, and the
Right.
Adon no longer owns her as an Amma, but she goes back into the Rishus of the father because of the pasuk B'nurea Beis Avia, Kol Shvach Nurei Lavia, and he receives her wages, and any money that she accrues goes to the father, and if she dies, the father inherits her, and the father will be made for 100 darim. All of those dinim are chal even after Simonim, and yet Simonim break up the bailus of the Adon. So you see that the father has a greater bailus than the Adon. And yet, Misa is, just 1 second, what's the Kal Vachomer now? Misa motzia mishus av, eino din shemotzia mishus Adon. So it means that with the death of her father, she goes free, and we terminate the kinyan of Amos. And that's based on this Kal Vachomer. Meisvei Rav Hoshia, Yisera olav hamevriya shekones atzma b'simonim. So this brisa focuses exclusively, to break up the Oma of Ria status on Simonim Isa Nisne Nami Misav Av. Why does this brisa limit its discussion to a case of Simonim? Why not add Misas Av, ton of a shir? My shir, the high shir. Vusepes, he leaves out Misas Av. Shir Misas Adon. Since it doesn't mention anything about the Adon's death, that was omitted. Therefore, he omits the discussion about the father's death. The Gemara says, no, I reject that. Imishum misas hadon lav shiuru. That's not called a shir. The came of the economy beish lo k'tani. Anybody who owns anything after he dies, then it's passed on through his Yerusha. But it's not the pshat that the death of the Adon is mafkia amos. Now we're saying the death of the father is mafkia amos, like Simonim. It should have been mentioned. The Ella Nisne, Tana Dover Sheish Lo Kitzva, Tani Dover Shein Lo Kitzva, Lokton. That which has a kitzvah, in other words, you can anticipate that at a certain point in her life, she, the Ketana, will become a Nara. And therefore, that's mentioned here, Simon. But Dover Shein Lo Kitzva, who knows when the father Nebuch is going to die? Lo Ketani. We can't really know exactly when she'll have Simonim. Even though she became 12 years old, it doesn't mean necessarily that what's the word I'm looking for? She exhibited Simonim. Omar Rav Safra, ein lo kitzvah lamala, but yesh lo kitzvah lamata. Rashi says lamala, emas de maisa li achar gimel shonim avi simoni naris. Okay, that we'll see. The Gemara says, avi yesh lo kitzvah lamata. Rashi says, Einom Simon. In other words, there is an element of kitzvah. We don't know exactly at what age she'll see the Simonim, but we understand that there's a minimum age. She's got to be 12 years old. If she sees these Simonim before she's 12, those aren't Simonim. So there is an element of kitzvah. And that's why Simonim are mentioned, but Misas Ha'av is completely only. Okay, then this is where we'll stop. And again, I apologize. I don't know. I hope that we solved the problem of the technicalities.
Yeah.
All right, then.
So, where are you? You're not in F, right? Where are you? Are you
living... So let me just explain.